December 9th, 1941. More than 36 hours had passed since the battleship USS Oklahoma capsized in the warm waters of Pearl Harbor. But for the men trapped in its steel belly, the concepts of day and night had ceased to exist. All that existed was a viscous, oily, absolute darkness, where time had dissolved, turning into an endless cycle of fear and waiting. The air was heavy and humid, saturated with the stench of fuel oil, scorched metal, and something else, something indescribably terrifying. The scent of slow death. The water. It was everywhere. The black, icy harbor water, already waist-deep, was sticky and dead. Every few minutes a tremor ran across its surface, a distant echo of the demolition work continuing above, in another world. And then silence would fall again, broken by only one single sound that kept them from going insane. Tap, tap, tap. A slow, monotonous, measured rhythm. It was Chief Petty Officer Marcus Riley, whom everyone just called Mac, striking a wrench against a bulkhead. Not hysterically, not desperately. He did it with the cold persistence of a stonemason laying a wall. 3 short. 3 long, 3 short. The SOS signal they had been transmitting for 2 days. Around him, in the pathetic beam of a dying emergency flashlight, sat the others. Their faces were as white as sheets, with black pits for eyes in which a primal terror was frozen. Jimmy O'Connell, a 19-year-old sailor who just a week ago was known as a cheerful troublemaker, now hugged his knees with his thin arms and stared at a single point, his lips silently whispering prayers. Next to him, machinist's mate Frank Kowalski, a man who knew this ship better than the back of his own hand, was trying to trace something with his finger on the damp steel wall. Diagrams, blueprints, something to help his mind cling to the familiar order of things. There were 7 of them left. 7 in an inverted world where the floor had become the ceiling, and the ceiling a deadly trap from which icy water dripped. They no longer felt the cold. Their bodies had grown accustomed to it like one gets used to chronic pain. Hunger had also faded, replaced by a dull, gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. But thirst. Thirst was their main enemy. It clawed at their throats, made their tongues swell, and turned every thought into torture. Mac Riley readjusted his grip on the wrench. His hands were numb, his shoulder ached with a dull pain. But he continued. Tap, tap, tap. In that sound was all his faith. Not in God, not in fate, but in a simple law of physics. Sound travels through water and metal. And if someone up there hadn't been deafened by the roar of war, they would hear them. They had to hear them. Every strike was a challenge. To the abyss below them and the heavens that had become the harbor floor. Every strike was a refusal to die. He looked at his men. They were at their limit. A few more hours and the panic he had worked so hard to suppress would erupt like steam from a ruptured boiler, and then it would all be over. But to understand how these strong, vibrant sailors had turned into petrified shadows, how their mighty battleship, the pride of the fleet, had become a steel sarcophagus, we must go back 48 hours to that sunny, serene Saturday morning, when the words Pearl Harbor had not yet become synonymous with catastrophe. December 6th, 1941. The Hawaiian Islands were drowning in sunshine and a lazy, tropical languor. The battleship USS Oklahoma, moored at a quay on Battleship Row, looked less like a fearsome weapon of war and more like a peaceful, sleeping giant. Its gray armor glistened in the morning sun, and the atmosphere on deck was one of almost resort-like relaxation. The war, raging somewhere thousands of miles away in Europe and China, seemed like a distant, unreal nightmare. A newspaper headline to be skimmed over a cup of coffee. For the crew, it was just another Saturday. Jimmy O'Connell, a skinny kid with a freckled face and perpetually tousled red hair, sat on the forecastle writing a letter to his mother in Ohio. He wrote with delight about the beauty of Hawaii, the pineapples that were sweeter than honey, and the beautiful island girls with flowers in their hair. He wrote about his plans for the future, how he would return home, buy a small farm, and marry his high school sweetheart, Sally. Every word he wrote breathed a naive 19-year-old certainty that life was infinite and only sunny days lay ahead. He didn't know yet that this letter would never be sent, and that his dreams of a farm and Sally would soon drown with him in cold, oil-slicked water. Deep inside the hull, in the engine room that smelled of hot oil and ozone, machinist's mate Frank Kowalski lovingly wiped a brass valve with a rag. Kowalski was a different sort of man. He didn't dream of the future or care for the beauty of the islands. His world was made of machinery. He spoke the same language as the engines, understood their roar, their groans, their quiet whispers. To him, the Oklahoma wasn't just a pile of iron. She was a living organism with her own heart, the turbines, her own lungs, the ventilation shafts, and her own veins, the intricate web of pipes. He knew her every corner, every bolt, every rivet. And lately he felt the ship was sick. Something had changed in her breathing, in her hum. The old Battleship, a veteran of the First World War, seemed tired to him. He shared his concerns with the officers, but they just waved him off. "Don't make things up, Kowalski," they'd say. "Better check the pressure in the boilers." Chief Petty Officer Mac Riley was conducting an inspection that morning. Mac was the embodiment of the old Navy, a man of rock, his face weathered with wrinkles like a nautical chart with lines of latitude and longitude. He couldn't stand sloppiness or laziness. He worked his sailors to the bone, forcing them to scrub the deck to a mirror shine and polish the brass handrails until you could see your reflection in them. Many disliked him, considering him a bore and a tyrant. But everyone, without exception, respected him, because they knew, in battle when all hell broke loose, it was men like Riley who held the fleet together. He walked through the ship and his trained eye caught the little things that others missed. A slightly loose clamp on a fire hose, a spot of rust at the base of a stanchion, a hatch to a lower compartment not fully dogged down. He reprimanded the sailor on duty, made him tighten the clamp and secure the hatch properly. "There are no small things on a ship, son," he grumbled. "Every nut and bolt can cost us our lives." The sailor nodded, but in his eyes, Mac saw only boredom and irritation. The kid didn't understand that this very hatch, sealed on his order, would save his life a day later by creating one of the few watertight air pockets in the sinking ship. That evening, many went ashore, to the bars of Honolulu, to dances, to see their girlfriends, but our heroes remained on board. Jimmy finished his letter, Kowalski tinkered with his machinery, and Mac Riley simply sat on the fantail, smoking his pipe and watching the sunset. The sky blazed with such colors it seemed as if God himself had decided to put on a final fireworks display. A sense of foreboding hung in the very air, but no one noticed it. They were all too intoxicated with peace, sun, and their own invincibility. That night, Jimmy O'Connell had a strange dream. He dreamt he was swimming underwater, in complete darkness. But above his head, instead of water, there was a sky full of stars. He woke up in a cold sweat, not realizing that this dream would be prophetic. He didn't know that the thump he would hear in a few hours would not be the beating of a heart, but the impact of a torpedo against the living, defenseless hull of his home. Sunday, December 7th began like any other. Reveille, breakfast, muster, nothing foretold disaster. The sky was cloudless, the wind warm. Around 8 in the morning, jazz began to play over the ship's PA system. At that moment, unidentified planes appeared in the sky over Pearl Harbor. At first, they were mistaken for their own. Someone even waved at them, and then the planes went into a dive, and black, cigar-shaped objects detached from their wings. A second later, the harbor shuddered from the first explosions. The world collapsed in an instant. The first torpedo struck the Oklahoma's port side at 7:57. The impact was of monstrous force. Thousands of tons of steel shuddered as if struck by a giant's hammer. The ship listed, and dishes in the galley crashed to the floor. Jimmy O'Connell was in his berthing compartment on a lower deck in that moment. He was thrown into the air and slammed against a bulkhead. His ears rang. His vision went dark. Before he could recover, A second impact followed, even stronger than the first. The lights went out. The horrifying shriek of tearing metal pierced the battleship's hull. Water surged into the breaches with the roar of a wild beast. All hell broke loose. The Oklahoma was an old ship, lacking modern anti-torpedo protection. She was as defenseless as a turtle without its shell. A third torpedo. A fourth. A fifth. Each blow was fatal. The list began to increase rapidly. The floor fell away from under their feet, turning into a sheer wall. Men screamed, trying to scramble upwards towards the life-saving ladders, but they slipped and fell into a churning mass of water, oil, and human bodies. Frank Kowalski was in the very heart of the ship, the turbine room, when the attack began. When the first explosion hit, he didn't panic. His mind worked with the cold precision of a machine. He knew instantly that the ship was doomed. The only chance was to seal the compartment. He threw himself at the hatches for the emergency watertight doors. Steam hissed from ruptured pipes, scalding his skin. Water was already flooding the deck plates. He managed to dog down 2 hatches, cutting off his and several other sailors' path of retreat, but also cutting off the path of the water. At that moment, the ship began to capsize. This was the most terrifying part. Imagine your home, your world, everything you knew, beginning to rotate around you. Furniture, tools, people, everything flew downwards, which was now upwards. The roar was unimaginable. Thousands of tons of metal, machinery, and ammunition broke free from their mountings and plunged into the abyss. Mac Riley was on the main deck. He saw it all. The Japanese planes with red circles on their wings, the columns of water and fire rising over the harbor, the sinking ships. He shouted commands, trying to organize a defense, but his voice was lost in the roar of explosions. When the ship began to roll over, he gave his final order. "Everyone, abandon ship." He himself was one of the last to jump, but the powerful current created by the sinking giant pulled him under. He fought, trying to swim to the surface, but the whirlpool was stronger. Just as his lungs were burning for air, he was sucked into one of the gaping holes in the hull. Miraculously, he found himself in a compartment that was not yet completely flooded. It was pitch black. He heard moans and screams. He couldn't see faces, but he recognized some of his boys by their voices. Among them were Jimmy O'Connell and Frank Kowalski. They were caught in the same trap. The entire process from the first torpedo strike to the complete capsizing of the battleship took less than 12 minutes. 12 minutes, and the mighty warship had become a steel tomb at the bottom of the harbor. But for those left inside, time stood still. In total darkness, in the icy water, they lay on what used to be the ceiling and listened as their world died. The groan of bending metal, the hiss of escaping air, the distant muffled explosions, and then silence fell. A heavy, oppressive, absolute silence of a dead ship. McRiley stirred. He felt himself over. Arms, legs, all intact. He stood up. The water was ankle deep. He took a deep breath of the stale, oil-soaked air. And in that moment, he knew. If they were to survive, he had to become not just their commander, but their warden and their god. The first hours in the upside-down world were a hell within a hell. Panic. That is the main enemy in such a situation. It's more contagious than any disease. One broken man can doom them all. And panic began to spread like wildfire. Someone sobbed in the dark. Someone screamed for his mother. Someone just beat his head against a steel bulkhead in a fit of madness. The air, already scarce, was being burned up by hysterical screams. Jimmy O'Connell was one of the first to break. He screamed that they were all going to die, that they were buried alive. He began pounding his fists on the hull, demanding to be let out. "Quiet!" came Mac Riley's voice, hard as steel, from the darkness. But Jimmy didn't listen. He kept screaming. Then Mac felt his way towards him and with a full swing struck him across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the compartment. Jimmy's scream choked in his throat and he fell silent. In the ensuing stillness, Riley's voice sounded even more commanding. "First rule," he said slowly, enunciating each word. "Conserve air. No screaming. No unnecessary movements. Speak only when necessary. And in a whisper. Anyone who breaks the rule gets another one. Understood?" Someone in the darkness whimpered, but no one dared to object. Authority had been established. Thus began their fight for life. The first order of business was to take inventory. An inventory of their prison and their resources. "Who's here?" "Sound off," Mac commanded. They began a roll call. It turned out there were 12 men in their compartment, which Kowalski surmised was one of the emergency stations. Some had injuries, fractures, bruises, burns. All were in shock. "Anyone have a flashlight, matches, a lighter?" Mac asked. Silence. Then Kowalski's voice. "I might. There should be an emergency lantern in the toolbox." This was the first glimmer of hope. The search began. In complete darkness, knee-deep in icy water, they fumbled with their hands along what used to be the ceiling. They bumped into pipes, the sharp edges of torn metal. Finally, someone felt a heavy metal box. They struggled to pull it out of the water. The lock was jammed. For several minutes, they tried to pry it open. At last, the lid gave way. Inside, among the tools, lay the heavy rubberized emergency lantern. Kowalski took it with trembling hands. A click. Nothing. Another click. Heart stopped. It seemed as if eternity itself was contained in that 1 second of anticipation. And then, a faint, yellow beam of light cut through the darkness. It was like the creation of the world. For the first time in many hours, they saw each other. Haggard, wet faces smeared with oil with crazed eyes. Their prison was revealed to them in all its horrifying glory, a small compartment cluttered with wreckage, water seeping from the ceiling floor. But now, they had light. And that meant they had hope. Mac Riley took the lantern. "Second rule," he said. "Light on only when absolutely necessary. We'll need the batteries." He surveyed them all with his heavy gaze. "Now listen up. Rescue won't just come to us. They have to hear us. We're going to tap. But not just any old way. We'll tap out SOS. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. With pauses. So they don't think it's just the groaning of the metal. We'll set up a schedule. Each man taps for 15 minutes. Then a 15-minute rest. That way we can last a long time and won't wear ourselves out." He spoke calmly and confidently, as if explaining a training drill. And his confidence was contagious. He was turning chaos into a system. He was giving them a purpose. And a man with a purpose can endure anything. They found a heavy wrench, the perfect tool for their job. Max started first. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was muffled but distinct. They sat in the dark and listened to that tapping. The tapping of their hope. They didn't know yet that they would have to tap for more than 30 hours. They didn't know that the air supply in their compartment was nearing its end. They had only a few hours left to breathe. It seemed all was lost. But just then, the quiet machinist, Frank Kowalski, spoke the words that were both salvation and madness. "Chief, we need air, and I think I know where to get it." Frank Kowalski, a man accustomed to thinking not in words but in diagrams and blueprints, explained his idea. He spoke slowly, choosing his words like rare parts. "Look," he said, the flashlight beam catching his focused face. "There's a compressed air main running through our compartment. It goes to the torpedo tubes for blowing them dry. The system's damaged, no pressure in it. But the high-pressure flasks themselves in the next compartment should still have air. If we can get to the valve and open it, we'll get enough air for another couple of days." The idea seemed insane to the others. First, to get to the next compartment, you had to squeeze through a narrow maintenance crawlway that was now underwater. Second, no one knew if that compartment was completely flooded. If it was, whoever went in would simply drown. Third, even if they managed to open the valve, who could guarantee that instead of life-saving air, a torrent of water wouldn't blast into their compartment under immense pressure? "It's too risky," Jimmy shouted. "Sitting here and waiting to die is what's risky." Mac cut him off. He looked at Kowalski. "You sure, Frank?" The machinist nodded. 50-50, but we don't have another choice." The decision was made. Frank Kowalski, as the one who knew the ship best and was the leanest among them, would attempt to get to the next compartment. Preparations began for an operation more complex than any military landing. Their equipment consisted of wrenches and a piece of rope they found in the compartment. They tied the rope around Kowalski's waist. It was their only lifeline. If something went wrong, they could pull him back. If they were fast enough. Kowalski took a deep breath, filling his lungs with as much of the stale, damp air as he could. Mac Riley clapped him on the shoulder. "Good luck, son." Frank nodded, and holding his breath, disappeared beneath the black, oily water. Agonizing minutes of waiting followed. The men, holding their own breath, stared at the rope disappearing into the dark water. It would tighten, then go slack. That meant Frank was still alive and moving forward. A minute passed, then a second. Lungs would be burning from lack of oxygen by now, but the rope still twitched. In Kowalski's world, there was nothing but darkness, cold, and the pressure of water on his eardrums. He moved by touch, squeezing through the narrow passage, its sharp edges scraping his hands and back. He didn't know how much time had passed. He thought only of one thing: get to the valve. And then his hand felt empty space. He surfaced. He was in another compartment. There was an air pocket here too, but a very small one. He greedily gulped the air, which was even worse than in their own compartment. It smelled strongly of smoke. He tugged the rope, the prearranged signal that he had made it. Now for the hardest part, finding the right valve in total darkness. He dived again and began to feel his way along the bulkhead, which was covered with dozens of identical valves and fittings. A mistake could cost all of them their lives. Finally, his fingers found a familiar shape. This was it. The valve for the compressed air main. He tried to turn it, stuck. The valve had seized up with rust and pressure. He surfaced, caught his breath, and tried again. He threw his entire body weight against it, his joints cracking with the effort. In his compartment, the men were beginning to lose hope. Too much time had passed. Mac held the rope in his hand, ready at any moment to start pulling Kowalski back. And then they heard a dull click, followed by a growing hiss. The rope jerked twice, the signal for success. For a few seconds, everyone waited in panic, expecting water to gush from some crack. But instead, they felt the air in the compartment become fresher, cleaner. The pressure increased. It became easier to breathe. It was their first victory. A victory of human reason and perseverance over the blind forces of nature. A few minutes later, an exhausted but triumphant Frank Kowalski emerged from the water. He was met in silence with a dozen firm handshakes. In that moment, they ceased to be just a group of random men trapped together. They had become a crew. They had defeated suffocation. But their joy was short-lived. The hissing of the incoming air created a vibration that carried through the entire hull. And that vibration, or perhaps the very scent of life, attracted the attention of the harbor's other inhabitants, those who were hungry and were not trapped in a steel box. Inspired by their first success, the sailors began to systematically organize their existence. Their compartment was no longer just a prison. It had become their fortress, their Noah's Ark, in an upside-down world. The leader of this microscopic civilization was, of course, Mac Riley. He possessed a rare gift, the ability to create order out of chaos. He established a strict daily routine, if one could call the passing of hours in eternal darkness that. Riley's kingdom, as they would later jokingly call their world, lived by strict laws. The primary law was discipline. Shifts on duty were established. Those who methodically, hour after hour, tapped out the SOS signal. There were rest shifts when men were allowed to sit or even lie down, if they could find a relatively dry spot. Everything was rationed. The air, now flowing from the flasks but still finite. The light from the emergency lantern, which was turned on for only a few minutes every 2 hours to check the water level and the condition of the wounded. Even conversations were a kind of ration. Mac forbade idle chatter, complaints, and panicked outbursts. If you have something to say, make it useful. If not, be quiet, was his unwavering command. Frank Kowalski became the Minister of Engineering. He was responsible for all the technical support for their survival. He constantly monitored the pressure of the incoming air and tried to fix another flashlight they found, which wasn't working. He was the brains of their operation, the man whose knowledge their survival depended on. The role of keeper of wisdom and moral compass was unexpectedly taken up by the oldest among them, a cook named Pops Gallagher. He didn't have Kowalski's technical skills or Riley's iron will, but he had something else, no less important. A vast life experience and an inexhaustible supply of stories. In those long hours when the silence was broken only by the monotonous tapping and the lapping of water, Pops would tell stories in a quiet voice. About his childhood in Ireland, about the storms he had weathered, about funny incidents from his life in the Navy. His stories were the best medicine for fear and despair. They were a distraction, carrying their thoughts far away from this rusty cold box. They reminded them that somewhere out there, another world existed. A world with sun, laughter, and hot food. Jimmy O'Connell, initially broken, gradually recovered under the influence of this iron discipline. He diligently took his tapping shifts, hammering the bulkhead with the wrench in a fury. In those strikes, he vented all his fear and rage. They even created their own economy. The only currency they had was fresh water. They discovered that from one of the damaged pipes, condensate from the cooling system was slowly dripping, drop by drop. It wasn't the cleanest water, but it was water. They placed an empty tin can under it. In an hour, it would collect no more than a mouthful. These precious sips were distributed in strict order, with the wounded getting first priority. A sip of water became their ultimate reward, their symbol of hope. This is how they lived, hour by hour, shift by shift. Their empire gave them more than just physical resources. It gave them something greater, a sense of control over their situation. They were no longer pathetic victims awaiting death. They were fighters. They were the crew of a sunken ship that continued to fight. Their lives fell into a harsh but predictable rhythm. They even got used to the darkness, the cold, the constant tapping. But the human psyche is a fragile thing, and the constant tension, fear, and deprivation were bound to take their toll. Not everyone was prepared to live by the laws of this new world. In the darkness of their steel tomb, in souls tormented by despair, a mutiny began to brew. A man can get used to anything: hunger, cold, even the constant expectation of death. But there is one enemy that cannot be defeated by discipline and routine. That enemy is false hope. After nearly 30 hours of their confinement, it was false hope that became the cause of an internal explosion. Jimmy O'Connell thought he heard a tap in response. Faint, barely perceptible, but distinct. He stopped his shift and, holding his breath, listened. "Did you hear that?" he whispered excitedly. "They're answering us." Everyone froze. For several agonizing minutes they listened to the silence, but there was nothing but the usual creaking of the deforming hull and the lapping of water. "You imagined it, Jimmy," Max said calmly. But the young man was no longer listening. The idea that salvation was near, that they had already been heard, consumed him completely. "No, I heard it," he screamed, his voice breaking. "They're tapping. They're going to get us out soon." This was a violation of the main rule. His cry, full of desperate hope, was like a spark in a powder keg. The panic that had been suppressed for so long began to burst forth. Several other men succumbed to the illusion. They too began to claim they heard tapping. Chaos erupted. Men leaped to their feet, began to pound randomly on the walls with their hands, feet, anything they could find. They screamed like, "You're here! We're alive!" The system Mac had so painstakingly built was collapsing before his eyes. Jimmy O'Connell became the unofficial leader of this mutiny of despair. He was not a villain. He was driven not by selfishness, but by a sincere, though blind, belief in rescue. He accused Mac of lulling them to sleep with his stupid, slow tapping, instead of sending a powerful, clear signal. "We have to tap all at once, with all our strength. Then they'll definitely hear us," he shouted. Mac Riley tried to stop them, but his voice was lost in the din. He knew a catastrophe was unfolding. They were wasting precious energy in air. Worse, their chaotic tapping was blending in with the other noises of the sinking ship, and the rescuers, if they were anywhere nearby, would never be able to distinguish a meaningful signal from this cacophony. A direct confrontation occurred. Jimmy, maddened by hope, tried to snatch the wrench from Mac, the very symbol of their ordered struggle. "Give it here, old man. Your time is over." Mac shoved him away. "Calm down, son. You don't understand what you're doing." But Jimmy and his supporters were no longer listening to reason. They lunged at the chief. A short, ugly fight broke out in the darkness, knee-deep in water. And then Mac Riley employed what could be called surgical cruelty. He didn't fight all of them. He knew he had to eliminate the source of the panic. With a strong, precise blow, he knocked Jimmy off his feet. The young man fell into the water, choking. When he got up, the rebellious fire in his eyes was gone, replaced only by fear and bewilderment. The mutiny sputtered out as quickly as it had begun. The others, seeing their leader defeated, once again submitted to the chief's iron will. In the ensuing silence, Mac turned on the flashlight. He said nothing. He simply shone it on Jimmy's wet, pathetic face, and then swept the beam across the faces of the others. And in their eyes, he saw shame. He had defended his law. The mutiny was crushed. The enemy within had been defeated. But while they were fighting amongst themselves, they failed to notice that their true enemy, the ocean that embraced them from all sides, was preparing its final, devastating blow. It was precisely at that moment, when the internal conflict was resolved, and an oppressive silence once again reigned in the compartment, broken only by the systematic tapping of a sailor who had resumed his shift, that it happened. First, they heard a new sound, unlike anything they had heard before. It was not the muffled thud of an explosion, not the groaning of metal. It was a high-pitched, vibrating whine that seemed to penetrate the very steel of the hull. It was coming from outside, and it was getting closer. "What is that?" someone whispered. And suddenly, Frank Kowalski, who had been sitting silently in a corner, jumped to his feet. His face in the dim light was twisted into a mask of horror. "They're cutting!" he yelled. "They're cutting through the hull! They found us!" It was a miracle. For a few seconds, everyone stood stunned by this news. They couldn't believe their ears. They had been heard. They were being rescued. The joy was all-consuming, almost hysterical. Men hugged, cried, laughed. They forgot the cold, the hunger, the darkness. They thought of only one thing. Soon, this would all be over. But their joy was short-lived. The whine of the cutting torch grew louder and closer, and with it came new, deadly threats. Kowalski was the first to notice it again. "The air," he gasped, clutching his throat. "It's burning up." He was right. The rescuers, working from the outside, didn't know that there were still living men in the compartment, or that it contained air. By heating the multi-inch armor with a torch, they were burning up the precious oxygen from within. It became harder and harder to breathe. The temperature in the compartment began to rise sharply. The cold that had tormented them for nearly 2 days was replaced by an unbearable, suffocating heat. The steel bulkheads grew so hot they were impossible to touch. The water at their feet seemed about to boil. They were trapped in an oven. But even that wasn't the worst part. The vibration from the cutting metal had disturbed the already fragile seal of their refuge. Water began to enter the compartment through micro-fractures that had opened up in the welded seams, and it was coming in much faster than before. The water level began to rise visibly. Their rescue was turning into a race against death. They were caught in a monstrous trap. On one side, rescuers who were unwittingly killing them. On the other, the advancing water. They tried to shout, to tap, to signal for the rescuers to stop or at least slow down, but their weak voices and tapping were drowned out by the deafening roar of the cutting metal. Panic set in again, but this time it was not the hysteria of despair, but the cold, clammy fear of inevitable doom. They climbed onto the highest points in the compartment, onto some wreckage of machinery. But the water rose relentlessly. Now it was at their waists, now their chests. The youngest among them, a sailor named Billy who had been wounded during the capsizing, began to lose his strength. He moaned softly, his head slumping toward the water. Mac Riley held him, keeping him from drowning. He looked into the boy's fading eyes and knew that this kid wouldn't make it to rescue. It was at that very moment when it seemed all was lost that the whine of the cutting torch stopped. In the sudden silence, they heard a dull thud, and then another. The rescuers were knocking out the cut piece of armor. A second later, an unbearable, blinding ray of light burst into their world of absolute darkness. It struck their eyes, accustomed to the gloom, making them water with pain. It was the light of another world, the world of the living. The battle with the abyss had been won, but the price of victory was terrible. Billy, the young sailor, died in Mac's arms just minutes before the hole appeared. He couldn't hold on, and when the head of the first rescuer poked through the opening, he saw not jubilant, happy men, but emaciated, burned shadows standing neck-deep in water, and a chief petty officer holding the lifeless body of a comrade. They were pulled out one by one, from the darkness and cold of their inverted world into the blinding sun on the deck of a rescue vessel. The contrast was monstrous. The air, which now seemed unbearably fresh, burned their lungs. The sunlight stabbed at their eyes. The sounds of the new world, the shouts of men, the roar of engines, the splash of waves, seemed deafening after nearly 2 days in near total silence. They were on their feet but swayed like drunken men. Their bodies, unaccustomed to a solid surface and normal gravity, would not obey them. They were greeted as heroes. They were embraced. Their hands were shaken. Medics immediately wrapped them in blankets and gave them hot, sweet tea. That tea seemed the most delicious thing they had ever tasted. The euphoria of rescue was brief but intense. They had survived. They had returned. But very soon, that euphoria began to give way to other, more complex feelings. They had come face to face with the big world, and this world was not as they remembered it. They were immediately sent to a hospital. And there, the second circle of their hell began. The hell of bureaucracy, distrust, and cynicism. They were visited by staff officers, investigators, psychiatrists. They were asked the same questions over and over, forcing them to relive the horror of their ordeal. But there was no sympathy in the questions, only a cold, professional interest. They couldn't believe that men could survive in such conditions. They were suspected of lying, of exaggeration, of cowardice. Some even hinted that they might have sealed the hatches behind them to hide while others fought and died. This was the cruelest blow of all. They had fought for their lives, they had defeated death, and now they were being accused of things they had not done. Their brotherhood, forged in the darkness and cold of the sunken ship, was systematically being destroyed. They were separated, placed in different wards. They were forbidden to speak to each other. Each of them was left alone with his nightmares and the distrust of the system. Mac Riley, who had been a god and the law to them, was seen by the staff officers as just a stubborn chief who got lucky. Frank Kowalski, whose genius had saved all their lives, was considered merely a competent machinist. Their feat, their incredible story of survival, turned out to be an inconvenient truth. It didn't fit the official picture of heroic defense and tragic but glorious losses. It was too horrifying, too ugly. It told a story that war wasn't just about explosions and attacks, but also about a slow, agonizing demise in a steel coffin. and the system began to bury this truth. They were all made to sign non-disclosure agreements. They were forbidden from telling anyone what had happened to them, not even their own families. Their heroism was classified as secret information. They were simply erased from history. An investigative experiment, which was eventually conducted, confirmed their story. A simulation showed that their methodical, ordered tapping, unlike chaotic banging, could indeed have been heard through the thickness of water and metal. But instead of medals, they received orders to disband the remaining crew of the Oklahoma and transfer them to other ships and bases. Their brotherhood, their small empire created at the bottom of the harbor, was finally destroyed. Their heroism was buried alive, not beneath the waves this time, but in dusty archival folders. The fates of the survivors varied, but the life of each one was indelibly marked by what they had endured. They returned from the upside-down world, but that world remained inside them forever. They had won their small war, but lost the battle against a larger world that would not or could not understand their truth. Chief Petty Officer Mac Riley, the Man of Rock, never recovered from the loss of his ship and his men. He was medically discharged. The official diagnosis was combat stress, but everyone understood his soul was being eaten away by something more. He settled in a small house on the California coast and, until the end of his days, would walk out to the shore every evening, sit on the sand, smoke his pipe, and stare at the ocean. He never told anyone what happened at Pearl Harbor. He just remained silent and watched the water that had become both his tomb and his salvation. He died of a heart attack in 1968. His neighbors said that even in his final moments, he didn't make a sound, as if he were still conserving air until his final day. Frank Kowalski, the brilliant machinist, stayed in the Navy. He served through the entire war, on destroyers and aircraft carriers. He was well regarded, considered one of the best specialists, but something inside him had broken. He became withdrawn, reclusive. He lost his trust in machinery. It was said he could sit for hours in an engine room in complete silence just listening to the ship's breathing. After the war, he worked in the Merchant Marine but never started a family. He passed away alone, in a small apartment in Chicago, surrounded by his blueprints and diagrams, which could never explain to him the greatest mystery of all, the cruelty of human memory. The fate of Jimmy O'Connell, the young man who had led the mutiny of despair, was the most tragic. His psyche couldn't take it. He couldn't live with the guilt of his weakness and the bitterness of an unjust world. He was haunted by nightmares. He constantly felt the water rising, the ceiling lowering, the air running out. He was discharged, returned to his native Ohio, but couldn't find his place in civilian life. He didn't marry his Sally, didn't buy the farm. He started drinking. He was found hanged in a barn on his father's farm in 1947. His suicide note contained only 2 words: too close. The other survivors also scattered across America, carrying their secret with them. Their story was officially forgotten. The Battleship Oklahoma, raised from the harbor floor with immense difficulty, was never fully repaired. She was sold for scrap. But fate had other plans. While being towed to California, the tow lines snapped, and the old, battered ship sank beneath the waves for good. She chose to find her final resting place in the ocean's abyss, rather than under the blades of cutting torches. She took with her the secrets and souls of the 429 sailors who remained forever within her hull. He was buried at the old naval cemetery in Honolulu, next to the other victims of Pearl Harbor. But, as the groundskeepers used to say, a quiet, barely audible tapping could often be heard at his unmarked headstone. No one knew who was making it. The official history of war is written by the victors. It has room for great battles, heroic deeds, and the wise decisions of commanders. But it almost never has room for stories like that of the survivors of the USS Oklahoma. It's too inconvenient, too terrifying. It serves as a reminder that the most terrible enemy in war is not the opposing soldier, but chaos, fear, and oblivion. The official archives hold only dry lines of text. As a result of the attack on Pearl Harbor, The battleship USS Oklahoma, BB-37 capsized. 429 crew members were killed. 32 men were rescued from the hull several days later. 32. And not a word about how they were rescued. Not a word about Riley's system, about Kowalski's genius, about the courage of every man who fought for his life in an upside-down hell. But human history is not made of official documents alone. It's made of legends, myths, and stories passed down in whispers. And the story of the Oklahoma's sailors did not vanish without a trace. It became a legend. Among the rescuers and divers who worked at Pearl Harbor for months afterward, a belief took hold. They said that sometimes, in the dead of night, a muffled, methodical tapping could be heard from the depths, from the twisted wrecks of the sunken ships. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. It was said to be the souls of the lost sailors still calling for help. But the old veterans, the ones who knew the truth, would smile into their gray mustaches and say, "No, that's not a call for help. It's a reminder. They're reminding us that even when your world is turned upside down, even when you're buried alive at the bottom of the ocean, as long as you can still tap, you are alive." This story is not just a chronicle of a forgotten feat. It is a parable about the power of the human spirit, about how, in any situation, no matter how hopeless, order can conquer chaos, intellect can defeat the blind forces of nature, and hope, even the faintest glimmer, can break through tons of steel and water. It is a reminder that the true heroes are not those whose names adorn monuments, but those who, in total darkness, in freezing water, continue to methodically tap, believing they will be heard. Let us know what you think of this story in the comments, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other forgotten pages of history that we are raising from the abyss of oblivion.